Picture this. You're on a train rattling across a country you've never seen before. Through dust-streaked windows, endless yellow grass rolls beneath a sky so wide it seems to swallow the whole world. The air smells like metal and heat. You're traveling with dozens of other women, all of you prisoners of war, heading somewhere in America. And every single rumor you've heard about American prison camps paints the same terrifying picture: cruelty, humiliation, and punishment. This was reality for hundreds of German women in 1945. They'd worked as secretaries, radio operators, nurses, and medical assistants during the war. They'd survived Germany's collapse, the chaos of capture in Austria, and a terrifying voyage across the Atlantic Ocean. Now they were being transported deep into the heart of Texas, and they had absolutely no idea what awaited them. The women sat in silence during those long days on the train. They'd survived years of war, seen their homeland crumble, and watched Europe disappear behind them as their ship crossed the cold, merciless Atlantic. Some whispered that they'd be sent to labor camps. Others believed they'd simply vanish forever into the American desert. Not a single one dared to hope for mercy. When the train finally stopped at a place called Huntsville, they braced themselves for the worst. They expected shouting guards, barking dogs, maybe worse. Instead, the door opened to sunlight and silence. What happened next would shatter everything they'd been told about America, everything they'd been taught to believe about their enemy. Waiting for them on that dusty Texas platform were men in khaki uniforms who looked relaxed but alert. Some of these American soldiers were barely older than the women themselves. Then a sergeant with a slow Texas drawl stepped forward and said words that didn't compute. "Welcome to Huntsville, ladies. Let's get you settled." Welcome? Settled? These weren't words prisoners expected to hear. One of the women expected to be treated like a criminal. Instead, she was handed a canteen of cold water. Another soldier, with freckles scattered across his face, offered her a cigarette with a small smile. "You've had a long ride," he said gently. "Rest a bit. You're safe now." She took the cigarette, too stunned to speak. In that single moment, all the propaganda slogans she'd repeated about American savagery dissolved into dust. These weren't the monsters she'd been warned about. They were marched, not driven, to a camp that looked nothing like a prison. Yes, barbed wire stood at the perimeter, but inside there were wooden barracks, tidy walkways, and even a patch of green where laundry fluttered in the wind. The women had expected snarls and suspicion. What they saw instead were calm faces, quiet efficiency, and a strange, unsettling kindness. Then came the first meal. Fresh bread, butter, eggs, coffee, even bacon, food that had vanished from German tables years ago. Many of the women couldn't eat at first. One whispered, "This must be a trick." Another said, "They feed us like officers." One woman could only stare at her plate, tears blurring her vision. She had expected punishment. Instead, she'd been met with humanity. But wait, because the story gets even more unbelievable. That same afternoon, something caught the women's attention near the far fence. A group of men on horseback, real cowboys like in the American movies some of them had secretly watched before the war. Their laughter drifted across the field, light and easy. One of them noticed the women watching and waved. When they didn't respond, he shouted, "You ever ridden one of these?" The women laughed nervously, unsure if it was mockery. The cowboy tipped his hat and grinned. "Don't worry," he said, "they don't bite unless you do." For the first time since capture, laughter rippled through the group. That sound, fear melting into disbelief, was the beginning of something none of them could name yet. That night, beneath stars brighter than any she'd ever seen, one woman wrote in her diary, "We expected chains, but they gave us reins. I do not yet understand this country. Perhaps that is the point. Perhaps America is not meant to be understood, only experienced." She had no idea that by sunrise, she'd be offered the one thing no prisoner expected: freedom on horseback. Morning came early in Texas. The air was cool, filled with the faint scent of pine and dust.
For the first time in years, the women awoke not to sirens or shelling, but to the sound of birds. It felt unnatural to wake in silence. Sunlight streamed through the slats in the wooden barracks. The room smelled of soap and something they'd forgotten existed: clean linens. Each bed had a sheet, a pillow, and a folded blanket. When one woman sat up, her bunkmate stared at her in disbelief. "Did they wash our clothes?" she whispered. Their uniforms, once grimy and sweat-stained, had been neatly folded at the foot of each bed. Someone had washed them overnight. After roll call came breakfast in a mess hall that smelled like warmth and grease and something heavenly: coffee. Steam rose from metal trays filled with scrambled eggs, bacon, toast, and butter. The sight of it made several women stop in place. For a moment, no one moved. The officer in charge noticed their hesitation. "It's all right," he said. "You can eat. You're prisoners, not animals." When one woman sat down, her hands trembled. She took a bite of bacon and froze. The salt, the smoke, the texture, it all felt unreal. Her throat tightened. Around her, other women began to cry silently, the tears of people who no longer had to starve. Across the room, one guard whispered to another, "They're acting like it's a feast." The older guard replied, "For them, it probably is." By the third day, the women had begun to settle in to the strange rhythm of life at the camp. Every morning brought the same routine: roll call, breakfast, then assigned duties in the laundry, kitchens, or gardens. But beneath the order and quiet, curiosity was growing. How could a nation capable of such destruction treat its enemies with such gentleness? That afternoon, while they were hanging laundry near the fence, the sound of laughter drifted across the field again. A group of cowboys on horseback was riding near the outer pasture. Their movements were easy, unhurried, as if they owned the horizon itself. The horses were magnificent, tall, muscular, their coats gleaming in the sun. The cowboys noticed the women watching. One of them, a tall man with sunburned skin and a wide-brimmed hat, reined his horse to a stop near the fence. He tipped his hat with a grin. "Afternoon, ladies," he called out in that rolling Texas accent. The women froze, unsure how to respond. They weren't used to being addressed so casually, certainly not by men in uniform, and never by enemies. One woman gave a cautious nod. The cowboy smiled wider. "You ever ridden one of these before?" he asked, patting his horse's neck. His tone was light, teasing, but not mocking. Some of the women exchanged nervous glances. One whispered, "Is he joking?" Another muttered, "It must be a trap." But the cowboy only chuckled. "Ain't no track," he said. "You look like you could use some fresh air." He motioned to a nearby guard who shrugged and said, "I don't see why not, long as they don't run off." The gate creaked open. One woman hesitated, heart pounding. For months she'd lived behind fences, every movement watched, every word monitored. Now a stranger was inviting her to step outside. It felt impossible. But something in the cowboy's expression, a mix of kindness and quiet confidence, made her take a step forward. The horse snorted softly. Up close, it seemed enormous. She reached out a trembling hand and touched its neck. The warmth shocked her. The animal's heartbeats thrummed beneath her fingers, steady and calm. "Go on," the cowboy said. "She won't bite." The women behind the fence began whispering, laughing nervously. One called out a warning. But the woman smiled for the first time in months. "It's all right," she said. "I think I remember how." She leaned down and offered his hand. "Then you remember what freedom feels like."
When she swung her leg over the saddle, the horse shifted beneath her, alive and strong. For a heartbeat, she forgot the fence, the war, the fear. She was just a woman on a horse under an endless sky. The other women gasped, some clapped, others wiped tears from their eyes. And somewhere between disbelief and laughter, the line between prisoner and free person began to blur. At first, her hands shook so badly she could barely hold the reins. The horse beneath her shifted with restless energy, and every muscle in her body tensed. She hadn't been on a horse since childhood, before the war,
before uniforms and fear replaced the soft rhythms of normal life. But as the animal began to move slowly, steadily, her body remembered what her mind had forgotten. The cowboy rode beside her, his easy posture a kind of lesson in calm. "Don't fight her," he said gently. "Just listen to how she moves." His voice was steady, low, the kind of voice that seemed carved out of patience. She took a deep breath. The wind brushed her face, the smell of sun and dust filling her lungs. For the first time in years, she wasn't being told what to do. She wasn't obeying anyone's orders. She was simply riding. Behind her, the other women stood by the fence, watching in disbelief. One guard crossed his arms, amused but not alarmed. "That cowboy's crazy," one said. The other replied, "Maybe that's what it takes to end a war." As the horse picked up speed, fear melted into exhilaration. The rhythm of hooves on dry earth echoed in her chest. The landscape spread around her in waves of gold and shadow. Rolling fields, a far-off tree line, a sky that seemed endless. She felt weightless, untethered from everything she'd been told to believe. When the cowboy slowed his horse, she did the same, mirroring him instinctively. He smiled. "You're a natural," he said. "I thought Germans were all business and no fun." She laughed, the sound surprising her as much as him. "Maybe we just forgot how," she said. The laughter carried across the field, light and human. The other women began to call out, half jealous, half astonished. "Let us try," one shouted. Within minutes, 3 more women were outside the fence, timidly mounting horses with the cowboy's help. There were nervous giggles, a few shrieks, and then a chorus of laughter that rolled through the camp like sunlight breaking through clouds. It didn't sound like prisoners. It sounded like life coming back to people who had forgotten what it felt like to be alive. From the barracks, the captain watched with folded arms. An American corporal nearby muttered, "You sure this is regulation, sir?" The captain smiled faintly. "Son, if it makes them forget they're prisoners for 5 minutes, I'll take the paperwork." By the time the sun began to set, the women had learned to guide the horses in slow circles. Dust rose behind them in soft clouds, glowing orange in the light. One woman rode past the fence where other prisoners watched, waving shyly. Someone called out, "How does it feel?" She replied, "Like remembering who I was before the war." When she dismounted, her legs were trembling, but her eyes were bright. The cowboy took the reins and said softly, "See? Told you they don't bite." She smiled. "No," she said, glancing toward the horse, "but they do heal." That night, long after lights out, the camp was quiet, except for whispers. The women couldn't stop talking about the ride, about the horses, about the laughter. In her diary, one wrote a single sentence. "Today, the fence did not keep us in. It kept the world out." Weeks passed, and the routine of camp life began to feel strangely familiar. The fear that had traveled with them across an ocean had faded into something gentler, curiosity, even gratitude. The women woke to the sound of roosters, worked in the gardens or kitchens, and spent evenings talking with guards who were quickly becoming friends. Yet what changed them most wasn't the food or comfort. It was the freedom they were given to write. One morning, the captain entered the barracks holding a stack of thin blue paper. "You're permitted 1 letter home each month," he said. "No propaganda, no secrets, just the truth." The room fell silent. The truth. It was a word that had lost meaning under their former government, where even thoughts could be dangerous. But now, in a land that had given them bread and laughter instead of punishment, the word felt sacred again. That afternoon, one woman sat at a wooden table under the open sky, pen trembling in her hand. The first words came slowly. "My dearest mother," she began, "you will not believe what I'm about to tell you." Around her, other women bent over their pages, whispering to one another for help finding English words. "How do you say kindness?" one asked. "It is still kindness," another replied softly. One letter flowed with a quiet awe.
They treat us not as enemies, but as people. We eat eggs and bacon each morning. There is coffee, butter, even laughter. They let us walk outside. Some of us have ridden horses. Yes, mother, real horses. And the men who guard us wear smiles instead of anger. When she finished, she hesitated before signing her name. Then she added one final line. Do not believe what we were told. America is not what we imagined. It is something far greater. That evening, the letters were collected. The captain sat at his desk reading through each one. Regulations required him to censor any line that revealed military secrets, but these letters contained only wonder. He smiled as he read line and line of disbelief and gratitude. When his aide asked, "Should we cut anything, sir?" the captain shook his head. No, let them go home as they are. The truth's the best propaganda there is. Days later, those letters began their long journey across the Atlantic, passing through the same ports, the same seas that had once carried prisoners to a strange land. Somewhere in Germany, in dim apartments lit by candles, mothers and sisters would read words they could scarcely believe. Words about cowboys, horses, and coffee shared between enemies. One woman wrote in her diary that night, "I have written to my mother not about victory or defeat, but about kindness. If she believes me, perhaps the world will begin to heal." By mid-autumn, the Texas air had cooled just enough to turn the days golden and the nights soft. The women had grown tan under the sun, their hands calloused from garden work, their laughter once again a daily sound in the camp. But something deeper was happening, something even the guards hadn't expected. The invisible line between captor and captive had begun to blur. The barbed wire still stood, glittering in the heat, but it no longer separated enemies. It separated friends by regulation alone.
Every evening after supper, a group of cowboys from nearby ranches would ride by the perimeter fence. They brought harmonicas, sometimes guitars, and the lazy drawl of country songs drifted across the open fields. At first, the German women watched from a distance, shy and uncertain. But eventually, they began to hum along. One night, a cowboy called out, "You ladies ever heard of a hoedown?" The women exchanged puzzled looks. "Is it a kind of dance?" one asked. The cowboy grinned. "The best kind. Come on, if you can't come to the dance, we'll bring it to you." The next evening, they returned with a wagon and a portable gramophone. The guards allowed it. Curiosity outweighed protocol. Music filled the camp, old swing tunes and Western ballads alike. A handful of American soldiers clapped in rhythm while the German women watched, hesitant but smiling. Then something astonishing happened. One of the women, a former ballet student, stepped forward. Without a word, she began to dance, not in the stiff, formal way of European halls, but with a lightness that matched the rhythm of the cowboys' music. The prisoners clapped. The guards laughed and joined in. One woman wrote later, "That night, we forgot who was free and who was not. The fence disappeared in the rhythm of a song." The guards noticed the change too. Where once there had been suspicion, now there was respect. The women worked harder, volunteered for chores, and began teaching the younger soldiers German phrases. In exchange, they learned Texas slang, words like reckon, y'all, and fixin' to. The language barrier that once defined their captivity became a bridge. The captain observed the transformation quietly. When a military inspector visited the camp and asked if the fraternization was appropriate, the captain simply replied, "They're still behind the wire, sir, but I'll tell ya, if the world had a few more fences like this, it might have ended the war sooner." On Sundays, local families began to bring small gifts to the camp. Fresh fruit, home-baked bread, even bottles of Coca-Cola. The prisoners couldn't believe it. They whispered among themselves, trying to understand how kindness could coexist with victory. That night, one woman wrote in her diary, "The cowboys bring us music. The women from town bring us bread. I think I am beginning to understand America. It conquers not by force, but by friendship." As the sun dipped behind the horizon, the faint sound of a harmonica played one last tune.
The notes drifted across the fence, through the warm Texas air, and into the hearts of women who had once believed mercy was weakness. They knew better now. Winter came early to Texas that year. A cold front rolled across the plains, whipping the open fields with wind and dust. The German women huddled in their barracks, wrapped in donated blankets, steam rising from tin mugs of coffee. The camp's routine slowed, but one thing didn't: the quiet bond that had formed between the prisoners and their American guards. It was during one of those cold December mornings that the storm hit. A freak ice storm, rare even in Texas, coated the camp in a glassy layer of frost. Power lines snapped, and the camp's generator sputtered to silence. Pipes froze, water stopped flowing. By noon, the guards were scrambling to keep the livestock from freezing. Cowboys from nearby ranches arrived on horseback, bringing extra supplies. And then, something remarkable happened. The German women, prisoners of war, asked permission to help. The captain hesitated. "You want to work outside in this?" One woman stepped forward. "Sir, in Germany, cold kills without asking permission. Let us help." Within the hour, they were hauling firewood, thawing pipes, and helping distribute food. A dozen women worked side by side with American soldiers, faces red from wind and effort, not from anger. The lines between them blurred completely that day, not erased by policy, but by shared struggle. The cowboy who had once taught a woman to ride found her lifting sacks of coal. "You don't have to do this," he said. She smiled through her breath's white mist. "Neither do you," she replied. That night, the barracks glowed with flickering lantern light. The storm still howled outside, but inside, warmth came from more than the stoves. Cowboys and guards shared what little they had: bacon, bread, and coffee. And the German women repaid the gesture by singing softly, old folk songs from home. The harmonies rose above the wind, fragile but defiant, like hope refusing to die. One of the younger guards whispered to the cowboy, "You ever think about how strange this is? A year ago, we'd be shooting at him." The cowboy nodded slowly. "Yeah," he said, "but maybe that's why we needed to meet like this, to remember they're people too." The next morning, as the sun cleared, sunlight reflected off the ice like 1,000 tiny mirrors. The camp sparkled. The fences shimmered, no longer menacing, but beautiful. It was as if the storm had frozen the world into a single shared pause. A moment outside the war, outside vengeance, outside everything that had divided them. That evening, the captain gathered the prisoners and guards alike. "You worked hard," he told them. "You didn't have to, but you did." Today wasn't America or Germany. Today was just people trying to keep each other warm. One woman would later write in her journal, "The war taught us to destroy. Texas taught us to endure. When the storm passed, I think something inside us melted too." As night fell, the sky cleared, revealing 1,000 sharp stars above the Texas plain. The fences glittered faintly under their light, and for the first time, no one noticed them. The storm had made everyone equal, and in that equality, something profoundly human had been reborn. Spring returned to Texas in 1945, warm and fragrant with the scent of wildflowers. Life inside the camp had fallen into a rhythm again: work, meals, letters, and laughter. Yet beneath it all, there was a growing tension, a whisper of something approaching from across the ocean. The guards spoke more quietly these days. The newspapers they shared carried headlines of Allied victories. Berlin surrounded, enemy generals surrendering one by one. The women noticed. Every morning when the captain read the day's bulletin aloud, conversation stopped. Forks hovered above plates. Breath caught in the air.
And then, one May afternoon, everything changed. The loudspeaker crackled to life as the camp sat down for lunch. A voice, steady and emotionless, read a short announcement from Washington. "Germany has surrendered unconditionally. The war in Europe is over." Silence swept through the mess hall. For a long moment, no one moved. Then the sound of chairs scraping against the floor filled the room.
Some women gasped. Others pressed their hands to their faces. One cried out before collapsing into sobs. One woman sat frozen, her spoon trembling between her fingers. The guards said nothing. They simply stood at their posts, hats in hand, understanding that this was not a moment for celebration, but for mourning. The captain stepped into the hall, his voice quiet but firm. "It's over," he said. "You can go outside if you need air." Dozens of women filed out into the Texas sunlight. Some dropped to their knees, praying. Others just stared at the horizon as if trying to see all the way home. A few laughed bitterly, caught between relief and heartbreak. One woman felt the tears finally come. "My brothers," she whispered, "all gone for nothing." Behind her, the cowboy approached slowly, holding 2 cups of coffee. He said nothing, just handed one to her and sat down beside her on the steps. For several minutes, they watched the wind move through the grass. Then he said softly, "You'll see your home again. Not the same one, but maybe a better one someday." She turned toward him, eyes still wet. "You don't hate us?" she asked. The cowboy shook his head. "Hate's easy. Building something after hate, that's the hard part." Later that evening, as the sun dipped low, the camp chapel filled quietly. German women and American guards alike gathered, not for victory or loss, but for peace. A chaplain read from ancient scripture about seasons, about times to break down and times to build up. When he finished, one of the women began singing softly in German, her voice trembling but clear. Others joined her, and before long, the entire room was filled with a haunting hymn that crossed language and loyalty alike. One woman wrote that night, "The war ended today, but it didn't end in Berlin. It ended here in Texas, when a cowboy handed me coffee instead of a weapon." Outside, the flag above the camp fluttered in the dusk. For the first time, no one looked at it as a symbol of enemy power. It was simply a piece of cloth moving in the same wind that touched them all. That night, the stars over Texas shone brighter than they had in years. The war was over, but humanity, somehow, had survived. By autumn of 1946, the Texas plains had returned to silence. The prison camp that once hummed with voices, music, and laughter now stood half empty. The fences still stretched across the horizon, but behind them, the barracks were quiet, beds stripped, windows open to the wind. The German women, after nearly 2 years in captivity, were finally going home. The morning of departure was clear and warm. A line of army trucks waited by the gate, engines idling softly. Each woman carried a small duffel bag stamped with U.S. Army property. Inside were the few possessions they'd earned or been given: letters, journals, a Bible, a pair of work gloves, and in many cases, something unexpected: a cowboy hat. One woman adjusted hers carefully, shading her eyes from the rising sun. The brim felt heavy with memories of laughter, work, music, and moments she could never have imagined when the war began. The captain gathered the group one last time. "You're free to go," he said quietly. "But I hope you remember that you were never our enemies here, just people caught in a storm." Several of the women nodded through tears. One, a nurse, stepped forward. "Captain," she said, her voice trembling, "I came here thinking Americans were monsters, but you and your men treated us like humans. Thank you for that." The captain tipped his hat. "Ma'am," he said simply, "the world's got enough monsters. We just tried not to add to them." As the convoy rolled out, local ranchers gathered by the road. Some of them had worked alongside the women. Others had sent food or letters. They shouted farewells, tossed small gifts, apples, chocolate bars, even a few bottles of Coca-Cola. The women waved back, crying and laughing all at once. For one woman, the journey home was surreal. The ship that carried her across the Atlantic passed through calm waters under bright skies. But as the coastline of Europe came into view, her heart grew heavy. Germany was no longer the country she remembered. It was ruins and ash. When she stepped onto German soil again, her family barely recognized her. She was thinner, stronger, darker from the Texas sun. Her eyes held something new, the quiet confidence of a woman who had seen kindness survive war. Neighbors asked what America was like. Some didn't believe her stories of music, horses, and generosity, but others listened in awe as she described the cowboys and guards who had shown compassion to prisoners of war. She later wrote in her diary, "They gave us food when they didn't have to. They gave us work when we had nothing to give. And when the world was full of hatred, they gave us friendship." Years later, when her grandchildren asked about the war, this woman didn't talk about bombs or battles. She told them about Texas, the red dirt roads, the smell of coffee, the laughter of cowboys under the evening sky. She told them how strangers had become family and how mercy had rebuilt her faith in humankind. The Americans won, she would say softly, but not just with weapons. They won with decency. In her old age, she kept a single photograph framed on her wall. A young woman wearing a broad-brimmed hat, standing by a fence in the Texas sun. On the back, in faded pencil, were the words she had written the day she left the camp. "Freedom is not the end of captivity. It's the beginning of understanding." This story isn't just about one war or one prison camp. It's about what happens when people choose humanity over hatred. It's about cowboys who offered reins instead of chains. It's about soldiers who gave coffee instead of cruelty. It's about women who expected punishment but found friendship. In the end, the fence that separated them wasn't torn down by policy or protocol. It disappeared in the rhythm of a shared song, in the warmth of a storm survived together, in the simple act of one person handing another a cup of coffee and saying, "You're safe now." Sometimes the most powerful weapon isn't a bomb or a bullet. Sometimes it's just kindness, offered freely to someone who doesn't expect it. And sometimes that kindness can change the world more than any army ever could. The barbed wire of that Texas camp is long gone now. The barracks have been torn down. The land has returned to grass and sky. But the memory of what happened there, of enemies becoming friends, of prisoners learning to ride horses and laugh again, that memory lives on. It lives on in the letters that crossed an ocean, in the diaries written under Texas stars, in the stories told to grandchildren who needed to know that even in humanity's darkest hour, light can break through. Because in the end, those women didn't just survive the war, they survived with their humanity intact. And they carried home with them a truth more powerful than any propaganda, that the enemy isn't always who we're told it is, that mercy isn't weakness, and that sometimes the only thing standing between hatred and healing is one person brave enough to offer a hand across a fence. This is what happened when prisoners expected chains but got reins instead. This is what happened when cowboys and captives shared coffee under a Texas sky. This is the story of how kindness won a war that weapons never could. And it's a reminder, all these decades later, that we always have a choice. We can build higher fences, or we can remember what happened in that Texas camp. We can repeat the mistakes of the past, or we can choose what those cowboys and guards chose, to see the human being on the other side of the wire. The war ended in 1945, but the lesson of that Texas prison camp, that lesson is timeless. It whispers to us across the years, reminding us that even in our darkest moments, we can choose compassion over cruelty, understanding over hatred, and friendship over fear. Sometimes all it takes is someone brave enough to open a gate and say, "You ever ridden one of these?" And sometimes that simple question can change everything.